Hello, I'm Garth Nix. This is my new book, FROGKISSER, which comes out February next year, 2017. I'm going to read you a sneak preview from it now, possibly accompanied by the budgerigar in the next room. Prologue, 10 years before. It was the middle of an ice storm, the wind howling across the frozen moat to hurl hailstones against the walls of the castle and its tightly shuttered windows. But despite wind and hail and the full chill panoply of winter, it was deliciously warm in the great hall. All 4 fireplaces were burning high, loaded up with double handfuls of small fir cones atop the great year-end logs. The scent of the cones was like incense, delicate wreaths of smoke leaving the fires, to swirl above the wriggling mound of puppies that occupied the most comfortable place of all, on the carpet in front of the biggest fire. There were at least 2 dozen puppies in the constantly moving pile, and 1 young human. A princess, though you'd never know it to look at her, since she was dressed like one of the garden boys. Unlike the puppies, she was sound asleep. The puppies became quiet as a great old dog, her muzzle silvered, stalked into the hall and approached them. She sat down heavily on the carpet and gave a soft, low bark. Instantly the puppies broke out of the pile and ordered themselves into 2 lines, ears up, all attention. The princess stirred a little at the movement and rolled onto her side. One of the puppies nudged her with his snout and was about to nip her awake when the older dog spoke. "Let the princess sleep. She is too young to hear what I am about to tell you, and she needs to live without fear as long as may be. We will need all her courage in time to come." "What about her sister?" asked the oldest puppy, who often took it on herself to ask questions. "Should I fetch her?" "No," said the old dog. She sighed and paused to sniff at something that rolled out of the fire. As it wasn't food, she continued. "No, for now we keep this between ourselves. It is a matter for the royal dogs and no others." The puppies barely restrained themselves from leaping up and wrestling with one another. This was exciting. But the old dog fixed the most wrigglesome with her sheep-stunning gaze, and they settled once more. "The new Duke is a sorcerer," said the old dog. "A real one, not just a dabbler. His heart is cold now, and will only grow colder." The puppies growled and showed their teeth. "He is allied with other sorcerers," continued the old dog. "The most evil, the most scheming, the most dangerous sorcerers around. They are not yet powerful enough to act upon their plans, but in time—" "What do we do?" asked the next oldest puppy, one who rarely spoke. "What can we do?" "Watch, wait, protect the princesses, keep them cheerful and unafraid. They will need whole hearts and the memory of happiness, at least, to have any chance of doing what must be done." The old dog spoke of both princesses, but she looked at the younger one, asleep on the carpet. The puppies all turned their heads and looked at her too, with love and adoration. Perhaps their combined gaze had some peculiar energy, for the little princess woke up. She saw the old dog and squealed with delight, leaping up to hug her very energetically, receiving several welcoming licks to the face in return. "A story!" exclaimed the princess. "Tell us a story!" Chapter 1, in which Morven's Denholm is turned into a frog. The scream was very loud and went on for a very long time. Princess Anya, who was reading in the castle library, ignored it at first, but eventually lifted her head from her book to listen. "That sounds bad," said Gottfried the librarian in his quavering, high-pitched voice. Disturbed by the sound, he immediately turned into an owl and began to vomit up a nicely packaged parcel of bones from the mouse he'd had for breakfast. It was something he did when under stress. Turning into an owl, that is. The vomiting just came with the shape. "It does." Anya frowned. It was her older sister Morven screaming, which was not unusual, but the intensity and duration of this particular scream were quite out of the ordinary. Anya shut her book with an emphatic thump and latched it closed, since it was a copy of The Adventures of a Sorceress Typesetter's Apprentice, and the words inside would otherwise climb off the page and go wandering around the library. In fact, there were still several words missing from an earlier reading, including the particularly troublesome pair of instantly and forthwith, which Gottfried now believed had escaped the castle altogether, or had been eaten by one of the dogs. The screaming continued as Anya hurried out of the library, across the inner courtyard to the main part of the castle, and up the private stair to her sister's rooms. Morven was the heir to the kingdom, at least theoretically. The sisters had not one but two step-parents, so the matter of inheritance was a complicated one. This was one of the most frequent questions Anya was asked later in life. How was it possible to have two step-parents and no actual parents? The answer ended up being rather straightforward. Their mother, who had been the ruling queen of the little kingdom of Trelawney, had died when Morven was 6 and Anya was 3. Their father remarried a year later to Countess Iselda. So they had a stepmother who was expected to be quite evil, but mainly turned out to be a very enthusiastic botanist. She was not interested in the children at all, for good or ill, only in plants. But then their father died a year after his marriage to Countess Iselda, and their stepmother married Duke Rickard. So the girls had two step-parents. Their stepmother, the botanist, wasn't a huge problem, but as it turned out, their stepfather was evil and wanted to be the king. The Morven should by rights be crowned when she turned 16 in 3 months' time. It was fairly certain Duke Rickard would somehow prevent this from happening. Perhaps he already has, thought Anya as she knocked on Morven's door. Not waiting for an answer, she went straight in. As expected, her sister was lying on a lounge in her receiving room, screaming at the ceiling and kicking her legs. Her maid, Bethany, was sitting on a stool nearby and knitting. Large strands of the wool she'd stuffed in her ears hung down her neck. Anya leaned over her sister and waited until two things happened at the same time. Her presence was registered through the veil of tears, and Morven needed to take a breath. "What's happened?" asked Anya. Morven stopped screaming and started sobbing. Stepfather, guessed Anya. It was far more likely to be stepfather than stepmother. Anya hadn't even seen Iselda for the past month. She'd gone somewhere far off to collect a rare shrub or a sapling. Anya raised an eyebrow. She could normally translate Morven's sobbing speech, but this was beyond her. "Turned," said Morven at last. "Turned?" "Denim!" Morven started crying even harder, so hard that tears were flying horizontally out of her eyes. Anya stood back a bit, impressed that this was even possible. Rickard has turned Denham into something," translated Anya. One of the greater disadvantages of having Duke Rickard as an evil stepfather was that he was an accomplished sorcerer. Prince Denham was the latest total amazing love beyond any possibility of measuring of Morven's life. The son of one of the kings from the petty kingdoms near the coast, Denham was a thoroughly nice young man, one of the better princes in the continuous cavalcade that came to the castle to woo Morven. Anya liked Denham, and thought he was unlucky to have soft, wavy blonde hair and blue eyes of the sort that made Morven fall in love with people. As Morven was remarkably beautiful herself, with her raven hair and warm chocolate eyes, young men she fell in love with usually fell in love back, at least until she decided she liked someone else better. The spurned princes usually retired to their homes to write bad poetry and brood by the fire, or they went on a quest and in the process discovered they also liked someone else better, or they got eaten by a dragon. Whether at home writing poetry, embraced by a new love, or in a dragon's stomach, they didn't come back. Getting turned into something was unusual. Denham must have been foolish enough to try to talk to Rickard over breakfast, maybe and ask for Morven's hand in marriage, which to the Duke would have been the equivalent of volunteering for immediate transformation. If Morven was married, she would have allies and it would be even more difficult to get rid of her, and without her gone, Rickard could never become the king. "What has Rickard turned Denham into?" asked Anya. A frog, said Anya. "How unimaginative. Typical. Stop crying, Morven. It's not the end of the world. Just kiss him and turn him back." Morven turned her great tear-swamped eyes to Anya. Her plump rose-petal lips quivered as if she had a fever. She made a choking noise. "Can't," said Bethany, who had pulled the wool out of her ears when Anya had started talking. "He jumped out the window into the moat." "Go and fetch him back," said Anya. "Then kiss him." "Thousands of frogs in the moat," Bethany pointed out cheerfully. "Morven will recognise him," said Anya. "Princess, true love, all that." Bethany rolled her eyes. "The Duke has decreed the princess is not to leave her chambers for a week," she said. You, sobbed Morven. Anya rolled her eyes too and sighed. I know. You want me to do it, right?" Morven sobbed, hiccuped, and nodded. How am I supposed to find him amongst all those frogs? I'm not in love with him, Anya went on, in the process answering her own question, which was just as well, for Morven would have no idea. I'll have to get a dowsing rod and tune it with a lock of his hair. I suppose you've kept one. Bethany snorted. Tufts and tufts. Lock it. Morven continued to sob. That's my dog dreaming on the floor next to me. Sammy. Sam, come up here. Come on. Sam, come on up here. Come and say hello. You've interrupted my reading, but you're a good dog. Here we go. There we are. Special spoiled dog. So, I guess that's it for the sneak preview. Thank you and look out for FROGKISSER, February 2017.